Okay, welcome to part 3 of our notes from chapter 1. And again, this is where we left off. We started talking about how cells can communicate. They use chemicals kind of to communicate, and they use what they call feedback. And here's a real common, what they call a negative feedback system that we have in our body. And that's what a lot of ours are. What a negative feedback system does is something's wrong, and then they release chemicals or whatever to fix it. Ideally, we'd like to have it so that we have a positive system, just keeping things in tune so that we don't have to wait till things are bad. But if you look here, here's a negative feedback system we have in our body. When we eat, we get more glucose in our system. That stimulates the pancreas to release insulin, and then the insulin's like a carrier. It takes the sugar in the cell, in your blood cells, and puts it in whatever, the liver, the muscle cells, whoever needs it. So it's like a ferry. It's like, okay, I'll pick up the sugar molecule and I'll take you to where you need to go. That's what insulin does. And again, if you're diabetic, you don't have that production of insulin. So that's why people that are diabetic are always testing their blood sugar. If it's too high, they need to take insulin. This is something our body normally does, and it's called a negative feedback system because it has to be too high, and then our body will fix it and get it back to where it's normally supposed to be. Okay, so in a feedback system, the product of your process really regulates what's going to happen. And it's really common in living organisms to have a negative feedback system, like I said. It's a response to something out of whack, and then we fix it. Another thing would be like when you get an infection, then your body produces more white blood cells, and the white blood cells take care of the infection. But they don't do that until you have the infection. So it waits till something's wrong, and then it fixes it. Okay? And we have all kinds of feedback systems in our body to regulate it, to keep it. We like to be what they call an homeostasis. Homeostasis means we like to be at a certain temperature. Our blood likes to be a certain pH. We like everything to be like at our normal. And when you mess with that normal, you mess up all your systems. When you mess with homeostasis, you mess with all your systems. Okay? Okay, one of the other themes is evolution. This is probably the last one we'll get to as far as the chapters. I think it's in the 20s. Evolution is basically taking information and trying to make sense of it. Why did things change in living organisms? And really, if you look, the diversity of organisms, we have two, animals of the same species, but they live in different areas, so they might be different colors. They might have different beaks if they're birds. Plants might have modified their flowers. All these kinds of things have changed because what they call evolution. Okay, and there is evidence to support it. They look at fossils. They look at since we've been able to record things, looking at changes. So there is some evidence that supports. But remember, it's a theory. Theories can change. Okay, so when we classify life, or the diversity of life, you can see we have 1.8 million species that have been identified. There's more than that, and they find more and more, especially like in the rainforest. Oh, there's so many different species there. But we identify them, we figure out where they belong, and we give them names. Okay, they say, yeah, the total number of species is probably over 10 million to 100 million. There's just a lot of stuff we haven't identified. And it might be bacteria that we haven't identified. It might be single cell organisms that we can't have. I mean, it's not just birds and chimpanzees and things like that. It's little tiny things. A lot of those things we haven't. There's probably a lot of insects we haven't classified. Okay. So when they started getting organisms, they started grouping them, and that's called taxonomy. Taxonomy is a part of biology where you name things. Okay. That's our job, is to name groups, and they have rules, kind of what groups they belong in. Okay, domains is the biggest. You might have heard of kingdoms as being the biggest. Domains, there's only 3, and this is where we talk about the true cells and the eukaryotes and the prokaryotes. They're before, pro meaning before the true cells, we had the prokaryotes. Okay, and there's 2 groups of those. There's the bacteria, and then there's what they call, well, we'd probably think of them as the blue-green algae. Okay, then we have kingdoms, and those are the biggest groups, and we'll talk about those. If you look up here we have a bear, Eurytus americanus. Here's a black bear. Okay, that's its species name. If you go up to one more genus, we can throw a few more bears in there. We got the polar bear and the grizzly bear. If you go to the family, then We can throw, and honest to God, you guys, I have no idea what that is. An ocelot, I think. But anyway, we can throw in a few more when we get to the families. And here you can see their names. And then the order, now we're getting into carnivores. So now we can have dogs and cats and all the different types of bears and everything. The class is mammals. So now we can add, all kinds of critters. We've got zebras and dolphins. We could add bats. We could add shrews. We could add mice. All kinds in this group. The phylum is chordata. That means they have a backbone. Well, now you're adding frogs and fish and turtles, all the amphibians, snakes, and then the kingdom is animals. Well, now you're adding insects and you're adding butterflies. And so you really get into group here. And then our domain is eukaryote, which means we have true cells. You can even put plants and mushrooms and little one-celled protozoa, all that kind of stuff in here. So domain is the biggest and then gets smaller. The way I remember the order, this is something I probably learned in 4th grade, you guys, is, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And when you name something, these are always there, genus, species. The genus name is large and the species name is small. But this is when, like, we're Homo sapiens. Homo would be our genus name. Sapien would be our species name. Okay, so you get, smaller and smaller as you go here. So the way I remember it is King Philip came over from Germany Saturday. You can make up your own. That's just one I used. And again, domain is the biggest group. There's only 3 of these. There's more kingdoms. There's way more phylums. And it gets, you get more and more specific as you move down the line. Okay, the 3 domains, like I said, are bacteria, archaea, which is blue-green algae, and eukaryote, which is true cells. Okay, these are the prokaryotes, bacteria, archaea. Okay, and that's what their domain is. They're much larger groups because they're really, really tiny. So you can have, on a head of a pin, you can have 1 million of these little guys. So that's why they take up so much room. So here's your, your groups. Here's your bacterias. Here's your blue-green algae. And then in the true cells, we have plants, we have fungus, we have animals, and then we have protista, protozoans, which these are the one-celled, like the algae. Okay. So all eukaryotic organisms, all organisms with true cells, again, cells with a nucleus, cells with organelles, are in that domain, okay? And the multicellular ones, we have plants, we have fungus, and we have animals, okay? And then last time I said protista, which right now they're still in there, but they're trying to move them in there and make another group. But at one time, all we had were plants and animals. They classified everything as a plant or an animal. So like, fungi like mushrooms and stuff, people would say they're a plant, but they really aren't because they don't have any chlorophyll. They don't make their own food. So, they kind of got more groups added. And then, like I said, the other one, the protista, the protists, kingdom. There's been kind of a trend to split the protists into several kingdoms because there's a lot of variety there. You've got you've got protists like amoebas and parameciums that actually have to engulf food. And then you have algae that make their own food. So right now we have like 2 groups, the ones that can make their own food, autotrophs, and the ones that can't, heterotrophs. Now they're saying that they should be split up, but I don't know when that'll happen. And we're just right now going to keep them in their own kingdom. Okay. So when we're talking about that, there's this unit that underlies this diversity. Okay. So because we have DNA, and DNA is the genetic language. Sometimes, like a little kid will wonder why, a human baby looks like humans. Why doesn't it look like a puppy? It's all about the DNA. When the DNA is, combined from ma and pa, they produce something that looks just like ma and pa. They have that genetic code, that blueprint to build them, and that's DNA. Okay. And that unity, our cell structures aren't that different. If you look at a cell, human cell versus other animal cells, it's not that different. If you look at plant cells, all the different types of plants have very similar cell structures. Okay. But it's funny when you look at, like, here's a paramecium, which is a one-celled organism, and it's all fuzzy. These are little hairs. They're called cilia, and that's how it moves. They rotate around. They go like this in the water because the hairs are moving. Well, we have that same thing in our lungs and our windpipe. Okay, we have these little cilia that help the air move along, but they also trap critters and stuff to keep them out of our lungs. And if you look at a cross section, I like how the paramecium is pink and the cilia from us is blue. I don't think they're boy and girl, but anyway, you can see that their cross section, they're exactly the same. So when it comes down to cell structures, it doesn't matter if you're a one-celled organism or if you're, animal with lots of cells, some of the structures are the same. Okay. When we talk about, again, we talk about evolution, the father of evolution, if you want to call it, is Charles Darwin. And what he did was he was a traveler and he went to the Galapagos Islands. I guess they're really cool if you want to go there someday, but he found a lot of different species that had modifications. And so he started doing, writing things about it and doing research. And he came up with a phrase, what they call natural selection. And what natural selection is it says, if you have a modification and it helps you survive better, then that you're going to be stronger and you're more likely to reproduce. And so pretty soon that characteristic that was just new to you is going to be more prevalent in the population. Okay. So that's what his theory helped explain, this unity, this diversity, why two birds that are the same species but live on different islands have different beaks. That was his big thing, beaks. Okay. So he said individuals in a population, their traits are going to vary. I mean, if you think about it, look at dogs. We have little tiny Chihuahuas and we have ginormous Saint Bernards. And they're dogs, So you have this variation in traits. And so when you get a trait that's favorable, it's going to be more likely carried on, because if it's a favorable trait, there's more likelihood that that organism is going to reproduce. Okay? And more offspring are going to be produced and survive because of competition. So if you have a beak that's better at breaking into seeds, you get more food, you are stronger, you produce more offspring, then you got more, birds with that beak, and the other ones that don't have that beak, they don't do as well, they don't produce as, they don't have offspring, and then they die out. Okay, so that's kind of what natural selection is selecting traits that are better for the environment, and then that organism will be stronger and tougher and then will produce more. Okay, so he inferred that if they're best suited for their environment, they're more likely to survive and to reproduce. Okay, and again, over time, that trait will be advantageous. In other words, it'll work for them. Okay, that's what evolution really means. It's unequal reproductive, and the success of the individuals with the better traits are the ones that reproduce more. Okay, so nature selects for these traits, these beneficial traits. Okay, and again, that's what he called natural selection. All right, and really what it is it's adaptation of an organism to an environment. Okay, most animals that live in cold have small ears, shorter limbs, because they want to keep the heat in. And your arms and your legs, your head, all those areas, smaller areas, are a way to lose heat. If you look at animals in the desert, they have longer ears, longer arms and legs, because they want to dissipate the heat. If you live in cold, you want to have shorter so that you can keep in the heat. And again, that's natural selection. The one that had those were the ones that survived better. Here we talk about bat wings was an adaptation of arms. Pretty soon we had these flaps and they could fly, and so you got all that. So again, when you're looking at evolution, they have what they call the tree of life, and you can actually put in the descendants. Here again, they're talking about the fore limb of a bat is the same really as a human's and a horse and a flipper, but skeletally, but then you've got these other appendages on them or other skin parts. And again, you can see that in the fossil record, how it changed over time. All right. So Darwin, he's the one, he gets credit for natural selection. And he's said the one that if you have enough change, you can actually end up with more species. They can be descendants of each other, but they're too far apart to actually be in the same species. And again, he's the one that he did a lot of his research in the Galapagos Island, and that's where he found it. I'll show you a diagram here. Here's his finches. Oops, sorry, I'm covering up some of them, but the common ancestor, and then you can see all the changes that occurred in their beaks because of the food source that was available. So you got all these new species arising, and they all came from one ancestor. And again, this is your natural selection. These guys, wherever they were, this was the beak style that worked better. And so it worked, again, this is what you call natural selection, coming from one, little changes